Now you're welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. Enda call here with you as we dissect Celtic's 3-1 defeat to RB Leipzig in the Champions League. It could have been worse. It could have been 5-1, 2 disallowed goals for RB Leipzig on the night, and it was pretty much as bad as you could expect in terms of the results for Celtic. All is not lost, though. They still have 2 home fixtures against RB Leipzig and Shakhtar that they can still mathematically get through this group, but it is becoming more unlikely as the weeks go on in this competition. It was not a fun night to be a Celtic supporter, and honestly, the reaction online afterwards was not a fun place to be either. So we're going to try do our best to work our way through this game, analyze it to the best of our ability, and try to take some of the maybe cognitive biases out of our reaction for this game. Jiko James is with me as always, as is Alan Morrison, as we try to dissect this one. Alan, I'll come to you first. This was probably the game that has most split the Celtic support this season. There's always one big game that brings an avalanche of rhetoric after the game, and I believe this was the one that did it this season.
Yeah, I can only surmise that, when the draw was made, this was a team that it wouldn't be wrong to say they were in disarray, but they were certainly massively underperforming because they were in the middle of the Bundesliga, whereas, the owners and the investment they've put into it, and the performance of the side over the last few years suggests they're in the Champions League spots and that they're challenging at the top of the Bundesliga, and that wasn't happening. And, we kind of had I guess, thinking if that's the version of Leipzig we're going to play, then that we've probably got a good chance here because they look very dysfunctional. They didn't look like they were using the resources properly, in terms of the players that they had. And then, of course, they got hammered in the first game, although it was a very odd game. And then they sacked the manager. And whilst I wouldn't say that they are, seeing a renaissance, I suspect that was probably the most coherent performance they've put in since Jose took over about a month or so ago, and certainly, as James has been saying since the draw was made, their strengths very much are going to test Celtic in the most extreme ways, and that's really what we saw last night. That Celtic's defensive shapes, especially the defensive strategies, really couldn't cope with a forward line that fast, that effective in transition, and that sort of dedicated to throwing players forward at speed. It just didn't stand up to that stress at all.
Mm-hmm.
And we can dig into some of the fundamentals, because I do think, as much as Ange was frustrated at some of the defenders, and I know there was a lot of I believe there was quite a lot of criticism flying around internally in terms of the way that we're trying to play out from the back and being too safe with our passing and inviting pressure and putting Hart under pressure ultimately, and then that second goal. But I believe that we've got fundamental issues in how we're setting up that we can get into maybe later, which I think it does come down to the manager.
Yeah, look, there was loads of things to actually touch upon from last night, and we will get to them. And there are a lot of comments that have come in ahead of this podcast as well from our listeners on Twitter. And if you do have a comment, do leave them in the comments below. We'll try to get to as many as possible as we can before the end of the podcast today. But James, just wanted to get your thoughts on Leipzig and their performance, because I think while we will get to the Celtic performance, as Alan said, this was sort of the arrival of RB Leipzig under Marco Rose. Everything seemed to come together for them up front, and when they clicked, they were a really, really good team.
Yeah, I'd agree in the sense that they seem to be back to playing a coherent version of what Red Bull has been, kind of exclusive of that Tedesco period where, as Alan rightly pointed out, and he's exponentially better on that stuff than I am, as far as the tactical coherence and that kind of thing, or lack thereof. But after looking through, I rewatched the game this morning and did my usual kind of debriefing on the statistical aspect of it. I actually don't think Red Bull was that good. They were okay, I mean, they played reasonably well. But after having rewatched, I mean, even above and beyond the offside calls, which were right, they were correct. So it's not as if they were, kind of a lucky thing or anything like that. They were legit. They had a probably good 4 or 5 other sequences of play, and that's probably being conservative, ranging from the first 2 within 90 seconds to one at the 75th minute, one right at the end, where things where there were jailbreaks in transition, where just a little bit higher quality pass would have set people in one-on-one against Hart, that kind of thing. I mean, so as frustrating as it was, had just kind of normal luck or variance or whatever, if it had been one of those games, and this is what I've been saying, on an XG basis, we conceded based off StatsBomb a little bit more yesterday than we did against, not enough to matter, but a little bit more than what we did against Real Madrid. But these are the kind of games where, again, that level of XG is where you're in the zone of the Barcelona 7-0, the 7-1 PSG, right? Where you get this, and Leipzig's a step below them probably, if not 2. But when you concede these amount of chances to this level of an opponent, if they have a good day of passes coming off and or finishing coming off, that's when you get absolutely slaughtered. And we didn't yesterday for a variety of reasons, but it could have been. And that's ultimately where we're at is, I have it written down here. These are StatsBomb's data, starting with the Alkmaar away game last season. This is the XG that we've conceded against this kind of tier of a team and higher. So 2.43 versus Alkmaar, 2.37 against Betis, 3.14 against Leverkusen, 2.34 against Leverkusen, 2.76 against Betis, 2.51 against Real Madrid, and 2.54 against Leipzig. You can't do that. I mean, that over any kind of sample at this level, you cannot win with any kind of regularity conceding that amount of chances. So, and you're going to end up getting absolutely slaughtered eventually when you do that against somebody that finally has a good game finishing and or passing. So, that's the higher time frame context. And that's 7 games basically. And we haven't really had a game against this level of opponent where we haven't conceded that amount. So that to me is the huge concern. People talking about progress and all that other stuff. We're not having progress against this tier of opponent. And Alan's points will probably be a lot more adept and insightful than mine as far as why that is relative to tactics and that kind of thing. But it's kind of more of the same that we've had with different twists and turns and specifics with each opponent. But that's kind of the broader story from my perspective.
Well, let's start with the defense then, because it was not a makeshift defense, because Celtic have played this before, but it is certainly not Celtic's first choice defense. Welsh and Jens played as a centre-back partnership as expected when Starfelt was ruled out, as was Cameron Carter-Vickers. Juranovic was right back, Greg Tiller was left back. Now, I think that the defensive problems are actually not caused largely by the defense, but we'll start with the defense here, Alan. I want to focus on Juranovic and his defending at Champions League level and whether or not it is up to scratch. Now, I'm looking back at the chance, I may have been a tiny touch harsh on Juranovic when it came to the Nkunku chance, but I still stand by the idea that he switches off for that. Now, you pointed out that he does have 3 or 4 different things to concentrate on, but my point is that he, for one split second, is caught ball watching and is flat-footed when Nkunku eventually makes his run, and Nkunku is fast on the best of days. It's definitely not ideal if you give him a 5-yard head start. So that's a couple of times now Juranovic has been caught by pace in behind. Is that a structural issue where Celtic are playing too narrow and too high, or is that a Juranovic concentration issue, in your opinion?
I mean, for me, you have to start with the structure and the way the team's set up as a unit, because if that's not right, then individual errors will appear to manifest themselves when it actually isn't the individual's fault. So if you look at the position that Juranovic was in for that goal, I mean, essentially, I felt so sorry for McGregor, then Abildgaard, and the back four, because at times it was like the Alamo. You're looking at 6 very fast, very big, tall, 6-foot athletic guys running at you at pace who are all good on the ball. Because when they attack with 6 players, right? They kept 4 central in a very close to each other. And then they had the 2 fullbacks that would bomb on at every opportunity, and essentially it was a 2-2-6. When they had the ball, it was a 2-2-6 that they were playing, and we were trying to press high, which meant that when the ball broke down in transition, it was 6 against 5. Okay, so you're immediately outnumbered against a very high caliber of opponent, because the guy on the right hand side, like a bloody basketball player, his legs were longer than Greg Taylor is tall, right? And then the one on the left is the German international left back. So you've got this coming at you, and then the other 4 in the middle are fantastic technical footballers, and they're athletic and strong. Okay, so in the situation that for that goal, again, I would take it back further. So when you look at that goal that we conceded on the break, McGregor miscontrols it. Okay, that happens. But it's then the response, because when they get a bit of luck again, the ball breaks to Silva on the run, but when Silva picks that ball up, there are 8 Celtic players behind the ball at that point. 8, okay, and you've got 5 Leipzig players in motion to attack the ball, and in fact, there's only 4 Leipzig players at that moment when the transition starts. 30 yards from Leipzig's goal, there's 8 Celtic players and 4 Leipzig players. The rest of the Leipzig players are in position to go, right? Because they've been playing this way for a long time and they know how to play it, right? So that was a trigger for them, and they responded to that trigger very effectively. So when Juranovic and Hatate, who were the last 2, see this onslaught, the cavalry charging towards
Blitzkrieg,
actually, Nkunku's behind, Juranovic for starters. He's got to watch Silva on the ball, and he's got another player. And then when you talk about being blown away by pace, I mean, Juranovic, I believe, is one of the quickest, if not the quickest player at the club. Right? We saw at least 3 occasions yesterday where Maeda took his man on for pace and just got blown away. Jota took his man on for pace, just got blown away. They weren't even challenged. The boy just stood in front of them, took the ball, and off they went. So what we think is fast and what we think pace is at the SPFL level isn't pace when you're up against Nkunku or Raum even, or the basketball player Simikin at right back. It isn't. So there's an athletic deficit there. So to answer your question, I wouldn't look at it in that way. I think the defence were totally exposed. The sitting midfielder, such as it is, was totally outrun, whether it was McGregor or Abildgaard, and therefore individual errors will happen because the whole system has broken down at that point, and you're vastly outnumbered by athletically superior players.
I'm not going to let him off that easily. I think he switches off. Genuinely, I think he switches off. It really bugged me because he's the international player in that back line. He's the most experienced and quote unquote the best. And honestly, you're not going to survive at this level if you switch off for those moments. And as much as I believe, and I do agree with you in large swathe where the system does break down, the system breaks down much quicker when players switch off. And Juranovic switched off for that goal, and he was flat-footed, and he didn't give himself the best opportunity to get into position. Now, that's not to say Hart was in the best position for that goal either. But if we're talking about the defense, I think I would be looking at Juranovic in the hope that he would be in a better position for that goal. That sort of brings me to 2 of the first questions that came in on our Twitter account when I asked for questions ahead of this podcast. Martin asks, do we have a fitness or physical effort efficiency issue at this level of football. And then Forright asks, why has Ange changed O'Reilly's role? Why are we trying to press so much when it's not sustainable? Where do we strengthen in January with an eye of improving performances in Europe? So, look, the Champions League is the highest level that you're going to play at. RB Leipzig have been playing at for a number of years now. Celtic have not. These players have not. It was, for me, a schooling of physical effort, physical movement, and fitness. Celtic were not fit enough for this game. Even players who came on as subs were absolutely tanked by the end of it. But we'll focus on O'Reilly, because I think that affects the entire shape of the team and the entire system of the team. Alan, we've spoken about this already. We spoke about it last week in terms of the Motherwell game. For me, I think it's a waste of O'Reilly playing him in the 4-4-2 system off the ball and having him do most of the donkey work in the midfield, and it leaves us further exposed in the midfield when our forward line wingers don't come in and fill the role that O'Reilly is supposed to be. How much do you think that affects Celtic defensively? And then we'll get on to the offensive stuff in a bit.
Yeah, I mean, my point was that you've got to have some sort of shape, obviously, without the ball. And Celtic have gone for a 4-4-2. I don't particularly have a problem with that. My problem with it isn't the 4-4-2 shape. It's the way that they've implemented it. And last night, the problem was that the spaces between the lines was just far too great. And it's a basic thing. Okay, and that was really disappointing, because that should have been fixed from the touchline almost immediately. I think the defenders were spooked by the pace in their side, and they dropped off just too far, and that left a huge gap to midfield. But then there was a gap between midfield and forward, so if Kyogo and O'Reilly were pressing, it was relatively easy to play beyond that press. So that's a fundamental way that the team is set up, that spacing. We need to be more compact off the ball. We also need to spend more time in that shape. We press too often and at the wrong times and badly. And that's the other learning. And that comes back to the question that was asked there about fitness and perceptions of effort. Forget about effort, right? They were trying their hearts out, okay? Forget about that. And even forget about fitness. It's about experience, and it's about conditioning and being used to playing that type of football at that level against that type of opponent, and we just don't have it. And what I mean by that is, when we play against the Scottish Premier League teams, we've generally got between 65 and 70% possession, which means for the other 30% of the time, that's when Celtic can press. And when they're pressing, they can press pretty high up, and they're pressing against an opponent that doesn't have anything like the technical ability and athleticism that Leipzig have got, which means that when Celtic press, it's generally quite effective. And even if the press is broken, it's generally a lumped ball up to a big guy, and the team can recover back to halfway quite quickly and get back into shape. And they only have to do that for a small percentage of the game. Okay? Last night, you've got 45% possession, which means 55% of the time you're not on the ball, which means that suddenly the amount of time that you're pressing is hugely increased. Not only that, you're trying to press against a vastly superior opponent in terms of the technical ability of the defenders and their ability to break quickly against a team that's used to playing that way and actually wants to play that way. Because when they had the ball and Celtic were in a relatively medium block, in the second half, when Celtic tired, they were playing quick passes through. But in the first half, they didn't really know what to do with the ball, because they didn't really want to play that way. They wanted to play in transition. So the team are not used to playing, pressing without the ball 55% of the time. Not only that, they're not used to playing against teams that can break the press so easily. Or having broken the press and then playing against quick players, what you then have to do is you have to put in a recovery run. A recovery run is just a posh way of saying you've got to get your head down and sprint like a bastard to get back as quickly as you can. It's unpleasant, it's horrible, it hurts. And when you're having to do that time and time and time again, you've only got so many of those sprints in you before your body can't do it anymore. And that's what's been happening in these European games. We can't play like that against that calibre of opposition and put in the same physical effort that we use for 20% or 30% at the time in the Scottish game against better opponents who can break quicker, are harder to catch and are harder to recover against. We died in our arses again after 50, 60 minutes. It was pretty much a rerun of the Madrid game. At half-time, everything was pretty much level. Now, there was, as I say, there was fundamental weaknesses. We pressed badly, and it was amazing we got to half-time level, and that shows you how effective it can be, right? So that's the positive here, is that the reason that it was level at half-time is because we pressed really badly at moments, and we pressed really well in moments, and we made them cough up the ball in their own final third 8 times in that first half. We forced them into 4 defensive errors, and we were ahead on XG slightly at half-time. That's good, right? But it's fundamentally flawed because the team collapses physically after 55 minutes because it can't keep doing that. And that's the fundamental problem. The spacing is wrong in the defence when we are set back. We're not compact enough, and the pressing we're pressing too often for what is physically possible for our team to do at that level. And those are tactical. Those are tactical things. That's not the players' fault. They have to be addressed tactically.
And I think that's one of the issues that we're seeing with Matt O'Reilly is what you're talking about, these recovery runs. Is a lot of people were questioning during the game the sort of invisible man that Matt O'Reilly was, or when he got the ball, he was ineffective. I think he's just absolutely bollocks every time he gets the ball, and he can't do anything with it then because he's still out of breath from recovering. James, do you have TalkSport? Do you know what TalkSport is?
That's the call-in show, right?
Yeah. So it's very hyperbolic. So let's pretend we're TalkSport for a second here.
Don't encourage him.
No.
Well, before you get into that, can I throw just a couple of data things in?
Okay, go for it.
All right, real quick. I'll be quick. I want to say, because I know Alan's been dying for one of my boxing analogies, is talking about the spacing between the lines and this issue with the players being maybe a little jarred with the pace that they were seeing. And I mentioned that those 2 chances in the first basically 90 seconds or maybe 2 minutes, it's the old Mike Tyson quote, is that everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Right. So we very likely probably had this plan going in, and the plan wasn't to have acres of space between the lines. And then literally within 90 seconds, they had 2 jailbreaks where they ran at us, like Alan was saying, as if it was a blitzkrieg of 5-6 guys just descending upon our back 5. And they almost scored 2 goals right away. And so it's only human that's going to cause, some serious issues amongst people's psyche. And, oh my God, like, what are we dealing with here? So that's the first thing. The number is out of the games played this round in the Champions League, Manchester City, their game, they had the ball in play time. I've referenced this before, right? When we played Madrid, their game had 64 minutes of ball and play time. Real Madrid against Shakhtar, 61 minutes. Our game, 60 minutes. Okay. So again, back to this thing that Alan said, not only with all the possession, all of the intensity, the ball was in play about 20% more than what we're used to domestically, which just makes all this stuff even worse. And it was similar, actually a little higher against Madrid in that game. So I just wanted to throw those 2 data points and the conceptual point out. So sorry, go back to your TalkSport gutter.
Yeah, back to
gutter dwelling.
We're going away from all that shit and going back into TalkSport and the real radio for the real fans. No, look, what I was going to say was there is this opinion, and it always seems to happen when Celtic lose. Funny enough, it's a very quiet part of the Celtic fan base when Celtic are on a winning streak, and it's very, very similar to watching Ireland and being an Ireland supporter at the minute with what's going on with Stephen Kenny. Stephen Kenny is trying to play a different brand of football at international level. He's trying to change Ireland's identity. It's taking a long time, and against bigger sides, while we have put in the performances are better, and the performances are better than we've done for a long time. We're still coming off pretty badly beaten by the end of the game. So the question always pops up then, is this system too much for the quality of players that Ireland have? So let's take that in a Celtic perspective, because there is this opinion now with Ange that he's out of his depth when it comes to European football. The players that he's working with are not good enough to play with this system that he's playing in Europe. And the system itself is fundamentally flawed when it comes to playing at a European level. So I'll throw that to you, James. Do Celtic need to change their system in order to suit European football?
Well, based off of what I ranted on about the XG part, I would say unless we have a significant uptick in, and I put this on Twitter, I think yesterday or this morning, I can't remember. Unless we basically get the Ange level of intelligence in recruitment, meaning that, as I've been saying, I've been very, complimentary of Ange as a manager, meaning a head coach, the application of his system, that kind of thing. But that simply has not been replicated in recruitment. And the idea that we're going to be pulling 23 to 27-year-old talent levels out, which are basically upper championship, lower Premier League level talent, which is where our money is, our wage availability probably is, and that's at the high end. That we're going to assemble a team of those level of talent players to be able to play this system, given all the stuff that Alan's talking about, at this level against this level of an opponent, I think is just unrealistic. So that's why I've been saying, if we're going to attempt this project this way, really the only way to do it is to find the Werners and Cuckoo, or whatever you say his name, the basketball player, as Alan said. We've got to find those, either grow them, which, our academy is pretty much in shambles at the moment. And again, I know that these are not fun things to hear, and I'm a fairly disagreeable person when it comes to this stuff, but it is. I mean, objectively, you can't look at what's going on in our academy in the last 5 years and say that it's anything that's going in a good direction. So we're not growing them with any kind of reliability. So that's the Sevilla window, or the model, or Benfica or Porto. Throw that into the garbage. So how are you going to attract them? You got to buy them when they're 17, 18, 19 at that talent athleticism level, and live with the reality that they're not going to be mentally mature quite yet. And we just haven't been doing that. So, look at our recruitment. It's almost all 23 to 27-year-olds from that kind of tier. And you're not going to get elite athleticism in that price range with any kind of regularity, in my opinion. So you're going to live with this issue unless you change that strategy. And even O'Reilly's a perfect example. There's different forms of athleticism. O'Reilly, we've talked about over and over again, seems to have, high level functioning in certain aspects of athleticism, but he's not that fast and he's not that laterally quick. So can you carry that level of person in this kind of side if he's surrounded by elite athletic people, a bunch of 20-year-olds who can run like the wind? Probably. But, can you hold that kind of player for that kind of role, creative role, intelligence, game intelligence, vision, all of these things, if you don't have them surrounded by those people? And I think, as we saw, and we've been seeing repeatedly, we saw it with Rogic last season against this level, David Turnbull, same thing. You just can't be having this athleticism deficit and playing this way against this level of an opponent. And again, Betis is not like, Betis's wage bill isn't that much higher than ours, right? Neither, this talk about Red Bull and endless resources, that's nonsense. Like, they don't spend that much money. They're not spending money like a Man City. So their wage bill is probably about 2.5 times ours. So is it, these are if we're going to be ambitious in Europe, this is the level of team that we've got to be able to compete with. And we're not. I mean, we're just simply not. So continue, it's the old saying, the definition of insanity: keep doing the same thing and over again and expecting a different result. I think we're pursuing that path at the moment.
Yeah, it does really hurt my head a little bit how similar what Celtic in Europe is to Ireland at international level at the minute. So I'm gonna continue on in that vein. One of the things that we speak about quite regularly on this podcast is cup competition against league competition, and we generally talk about how league form you look at the performance, and over a long period of time you can actually predict pretty well whether a team is going to eventually turn or not for the better or the worse based on the underlying data. Alan, is what Celtic are doing in Europe, is it developing? Is it progressing? Is it, I know we're in competition number 3 technically of European football. We'll say the second year of European football of Ange, because last season doesn't really count all that much when you're talking about the 2 competitions. But is what you're seeing in the data giving you hope that at some point this will turn for Celtic? At some point they will take their chances, they're creating enough in order to get some more points on the board? Or are you more worried now after watching the 3 games?
So a little bit of perspective. I mean, we're very early still into this project.
Yeah,
right?
that is the
we've-
context I will
We've
use. The
literally got
caveat for all of this,
a sample of, arguably 4 games last season against Betis and Leverkusen, and then 3 games this season. We've played each team once in this group. So literally, we've got a sample of 7 games. I think we're forming this opinion on, right? So let's take a bit of perspective there. Also, you have to say that the team, albeit I know form at the moment is not great, either against Motherwell or St Mirren, but over a period of a year, the team have been moulded to play incredibly effectively this way in Scottish football. And that is definitely a plus. So the team can play this way, and it can play it against certain opponents under certain circumstances, and they've absolutely deserved the right to try to test themselves against the Champions League teams. Now, everything that I believe that is true, and it is also simultaneously at the same time true to say what James has said, which is that whilst we are creating more chances than we've probably ever created at Champions League level, it's difficult to say that the gaps between teams is growing all the time financially, right? So the Celtic team of Martin O'Neill, may have punched above their weight when you look back at it now, but the teams that they were playing weren't as far ahead financially as teams that we're playing now are. So it's difficult to make that absolute comparison. But it is undoubtedly true that we're consistently giving up, over 2 XG a game. And if you look at the SPFL this season, there's only 18 times in total that a team has got more than 2 XG in a game, right? And more than half of that is down to the top 2. So you can't, as James said, you can't keep doing that. So for me, I wouldn't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. Postecoglou is a world-known, respected coach. He's been able to implement his ideas in various environments. I believe he's also been able to do it at Celtic over the last year very quickly. I believe that he will get it right, but certain things need to change. We can't carry on playing the way we're playing exactly. It is about doing things better. I'm not talking about changing the style of play. I'm talking about doing it a lot better, because the problem at the moment isn't the style of play per se. It's that we're not doing it properly, or we're doing it badly. We're making bad decisions. As I say, the defensive alignment in terms of spacing, they have to be firmer in their high line. They dropped back too deep last night, and James is absolutely spot on as to possibly psychologically why that was. You have to be brave. You have to keep that compact, and you have to keep that high line, and you have to be more compact. When we're pressing, we just have to press more selectively, and that comes down to decision making. And guess what? That's the hardest thing to do. So what I'd like to see us do is actually press less, but more specifically and more appropriately at the right times, knowing that we cannot. We've only got so many. Think of it as a sort of, think of it as a sort of a tank of pressing energy. We've only got so much pressing energy in a game. You can't have used your pressing energy by the 55th minute. You've got to make it last to at least the 80th minute, and then you can always fall back to a low block at that point and see out the game or whatever. But you've got to get beyond that 55-minute sort of where your pressing energy tank is completely emptied. So those are probably small tweaks conceptually. They're probably quite big tweaks in terms of when can Celtic implement that, test it, because they against St Mirren or St Johnstone, what have you, you expect the team to go full pelt for 90 minutes because, again, 70% possession, etc. And so this is the conundrum, and it always has been the conundrum. What we can't also do is play the same way that's proving to be incredibly effective and consistent in Scotland, where we're consistently posting +2 XG difference against each and every opponent that we play. You don't throw that away, because that's almost like you've found the magic formula, right? And then say, oh, we're going to play completely differently in Europe, because that doesn't work either. So we have to do it better, is what it comes down to. Now, to come back to James on how do we do that in terms of player recruitment, this is where we kind of disagree, because this is exactly what James has described as what Leipzig do. Okay, so Leipzig can afford to invest between, high 8, 9 to 15 to 20 million euros on teenage players, right? Gvardiol, Nkunku, Simakan, right? They can afford to do that, because if it comes off, they sell them for 60, 70, 80 million. It's the same as what Ajax do. It's a different level of player trading model that we are able to implement. If Celtic spend €6 million euros on a player, it's a big deal, and we have to get it right. We knew what we were getting with Carter Vickers. We knew what we were getting with Jota. It was low risk. We can't spend 6 million on a teenager from West Africa and hope that it might work out. We could probably do that once. If it doesn't work, we're probably blown it for that year. Okay, so we're working in a completely different environment. We can't do it. The player trading model that we've got at the moment is relatively smart. We're taking players in their early 20s who previously have shown enormous potential to be in, and maybe even have been in that 10, 15 million teenager range, and it hasn't worked out. And this is their second chance at making it at a big club. That's a smart model. These are players that are hungry, have got things to prove, have shown in the past they've got high potential, and in the sausage factory of the big 5 leagues, for whatever reason, it's not worked out. That to me is smart, and it's probably lower risk. And that's where we are at the moment. So this is where I disagree with James. I don't think we can go down the teenager route. We simply can't afford to spend the money you need to get the athletes that Leipzig can get, and get it wrong even once. It's just too expensive.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think it's very reasonable, understandable, but I think to your point, it's the lower risk one, but it also dramatically cuts off the top, meaning that it raises the floor probably, but it also chops off and creates a ceiling. And I think that's, I'm not saying that that's an unreasonable path. I'm saying that probably means that we're sentencing ourselves to, a Europa League level team, and we're going to be in this group of teams that when you do make it into the Champions League, you're probably just going to get slaughtered. You're going to get led to slaughter, and that's just the reality of it. And again, that's fine, but it's risk reward, and I don't disagree. It would have to be, and I don't think Leipzig's the model. It's more closer to Salzburg, which that's where they live. They live with their Austria 2 team, Liefering or whatever, right? And we had a CEO hired who's talked about benchmarking to them, and he lasted about 6 weeks. So going that kind of route is not going to be easy. There's going to be risk with it. But that's the club that's pursuing this kind of path and making it work and selling people to Leipzig for 30, 40, 50 million.
Yeah. Okay. So we also need to grow our own in parallel at the same time, right? We have to.
Maybe we do, maybe we don't, Alan. I think where there's a lot of fertile conversation, because everyone's trying to have an academy now, because everyone's trying to grow these young players. So, where's the I haven't seen any evidence of, what they say, unique selling proposition, right? Where's the IP? Where's the intellectual property? I haven't seen any evidence that we have a competitive advantage to be pouring resources into an academy system, which quite frankly has been dreadful for how long.
No, I agree.
We have the outliers. So, who's the wizard that's going to come in and turn this into something that's going to be Sevilla or Benfica or
Yeah, no, I come back to, we're in the first year, and I'm like you. I want to see improvement across the whole.
Yeah, but when has Ange built that?
Football operations. Yeah.
This is where, again, he's a really smart, ambitious, talented guy, but we're now calling him the architect of a first-class academy. He's going to be the architect of a world-class recruiting system. He's also going to be the architect of one of the best coaches in the world. I call that fantasy land. That's not going to happen. That's the old model. That's Jock Steen 40 years ago, 50 years ago. That's not the pragmatic, the reasonable way that this is done these days.
No, I agree.
Can I just interject here for 1 second? Because look, we could go on for days about the future and how we're going to sell players for 60 million. It's not going to happen in the next 5, 6, 7 years. It needs to be something that's built. But what we have to look at, what is success for Celtic in European football. Celtic are not going to win the Champions League. We need to just give up on that dream. Celtic are never going to win the Champions League with the odds stacked against them in the manner in which they are. If you just look at the RB Leipzig team, for example, if you go on to Transfermarkt, and you can say what you want about their ratings and all that there, but they're more or less close to what they usually are. Christopher Nkunku, 72 million. Olmo, 36 million. Limar, 25 million. Andre Silva, 25 million. They've got more players that are over the 25 to 30 million mark in their worth. Celtic's highest rated player in terms of transfer value by Transfermarkt is Cal McGregor at 7 million. That's the competitive edge. But and the point I'm trying to make here is that Rangers got to the Europa League final last season and were a penalty shootout away from winning the second most prestigious trophy in Europe in club football. They don't have an academy system, throwing out players. They're not selling their players for 30, 40 million. So there has to be a middle ground here where Celtic work within the resources that they have and also do it on the pitch. And so far, Celtic have not done it on the European field. That's
right.
Is success for Celtic now under Ange in European football Europa League success? Because I would take a European trophy. I'd take the Europa League.
I think so. With all of my positive rhetoric about the future, tongue in cheek, where are we at right now? Well, it's basically where we were at when all this started, which is probably good shot at finishing third in the group, right? That's what we talked about when this group was announced. Maybe getting some real beatings from Real Madrid and Leipzig. Probably looking pretty good because Shakhtar plays a way that matches, actually the opposite of Leipzig, plays a way that actually matches up really well with us. And then getting into Europa League and hopefully having a run. But the analogy with Rangers last season, Rangers play a system that is the opposite of ours. It's more aligned with Europe and less so domestically. And we're the opposite. Relative to risk and variance, right? So they play a more defensive, a more counterattack type of way in Europe, and that reduces risk in a lot of ways. And it's the opposite of how we're going about it. I think there's plenty of reasonable discussion about whether that's a good idea, the culture of the club, all that stuff's important.
Mm-hmm.
But the practical reality is, for us to be going even into the knockout stages of the Europa League, again, these are Leipzig are the type of teams that we're going to face there. When you get into that last kind of quarterfinals forward, could we, have a good stretch where our finishing's great and the opponents is not? It's possible, but if we keep conceding 2+ in XG, that's going to be probably pretty unlikely to put a string together, right? You might get a one-off here and there. And I just wanted to point this out because, again, to put context into this, in the 3 years that Rodgers was manager, where we went into Europe, 2 Champions League, dropped into Europa League once, and in the third season in Europa League, we had 7 games in total where we conceded this kind of XG. Only one was kind of the weird one in Astana. Now, this is using Y-Scout's XG model, so it's not a perfect apples to apples. But the rest were against Man City, Barcelona twice, Bayern Munich, PSG, and Salzburg twice, right? So that's 7 games over 3 seasons. We've had 7 in the last 13 months, right? So again, I agree with Alan. The sample's not huge, but the consistency of the sample now, I mean, it's literally, we have not played a team that's of this level and not done it. And oh, by the way, throw in Bodo Glimt, that experience. And there's some extenuating circumstances there because of the selection issues and the prioritization probably. But so if you take that totality, that's the broader context, I think. And why, you know, I think having a reasonable expectation at this point. Now, can it change if recruitment continues to improve and that kind of stuff? Possible. But given our current constitution, the idea that we're going to reasonably have a late run in the Europa League, that's probably, I think, is probably pretty low because of the inability to keep chance creation from this level of opponent at a reasonable level.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really difficult conversation to have in terms of the Celtic fan base and what we expect from the team. I, for one, expect Celtic to be in the Champions League competing at a pretty decent level, and especially when we have what I feel is going to be a generational manager in Ange Postecoglou, who's going to go on to, let's face it, probably bigger things in Europe in the next 10, 15 years if he's not sticking around Celtic for that long. But if you even just look at some of the clubs that are competing at a lower level now in European football, Roma were the team that went on to win the Europa Conference League, for God's sake. And you saw what that meant to one of the most established managers in the world in Jose Mourinho. Rangers and Frankfurt were in the Europa League. The Champions League is essentially the Super League. If you look at the last 15 years, the teams that are getting to the quarterfinal, semi-final, final are coming from the top 2 of English Premier League, the top 2 of La Liga, the top 2 of the top 1 of the Bundesliga, and maybe one team from Serie A. So I think it might be a time to reestablish where we think Celtic should be in that world football pecking order. I think we're a Europa League side, and we're a side that could go well in Europa League, and we should expect them to go well in the Europa League. But I think a good result now for Celtic in this group stage is finishing 3rd. I genuinely do. And I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit defeatist in that, and maybe the older fans won't agree with me on that, but that's where I think Celtic realistically are in the world football pecking order in terms of finances, resources, everything to do with it, unless there's a Super League that breaks away now and the Champions League changes absolutely fundamentally. Celtic are not winning the Champions League anytime, ever again, never again.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's probably true in terms of the Champions League. But I mean, you know, because of the vagaries of football, low-scoring sport and all that, you know, you'd always get results in cup football, so things can happen. You know, so that's why I look at performances, really. And I think what we're trying to talk, what James's point is that over that 7-game sample, the evidence is that the performances, in terms of the ability to keep the opponent out, isn't improving. Okay, now I still think it's early days. I really do. But I'm, you know, I would move over into that camp if over the next, you know, 3 games, and then looking at, hopefully we keep playing European football after Christmas. And if there's still no improvement, and then you get into next season, there's still no improvement, you start to think, well, you know, you're not learning here, and that would be a problem for me at that point. Mm-hmm. It's completely normal for me for a relatively young team who broadly, apart from 1 or 2 exceptions, haven't played Champions League football, with a manager who's never played Champions League football, to play Champions League football and to struggle, right? That to me is completely normal, because this is just super tough. And you saw, you know, last night, the quality of the finishing, the quality of some of the interplay. You just, and you know, the risk is there. You lose 3-1, but it could be 7-1. Easily. Could easily have been 4, 5, 6, the more that game went on. And that's the inherent risk, playing up a quality, that level of quality compared to what you play every Saturday. So, you know, for me, you've got to understand we're at the very start still of this journey. I do take James's point. It's a good benchmark, and it's something that we need to keep measuring ourselves against to say, are we improving? If we do keep improving, I do think, you know, we still got the capacity to spring a surprise. But spring surprise isn't going to top a group with Real Madrid in it. You know, we might pull off a Barcelona type result and beat them once, We probably won't do it twice in the same group. Very unlikely. And then to do it again to a team who's the next rank down and not as good as them, but still a lot better than Celtic, to do that twice, again, highly unlikely. Okay, so we have to be realistic, but what we have to track is performances, because that's the things that we can control. We can't control how much money Real Madrid have got. We can't control how much money Leipzig have got, and so forth. All we can control is our own performances, and that's ultimately what I'm trying to provide context against, really.
Yeah, and I know we have to wrap this up fairly shortly. I did just want to get the one comment. I know this is completely sort of a left field turn that I'm about to take, but I forgot to get it in earlier on. I just wanted to touch on Greg Taylor and his performance last night, because the eye test tells me that he was playing pretty well. And a question comes in from Philip McLaughlin on Twitter. He asks about Greg Taylor's performance. Said that he looked pretty good in the Champions League and has done in the last couple of performances. But is this more down to people having a low expectation of how he would perform, or is this down to Greg Taylor actually playing well?
I think he's played really well for Greg Taylor. I mean, that's but
that's firmly
and I don't mean that as an insult, but again, as Alan says, these fine margins. The second chance within the first 90 seconds was Taylor getting beat by the basketball player on a header, which, again, nothing new, and then getting absolutely smoked for pace off a guy who's just his athletic superior. And that's the inherent fragility of a player of his athletic profile, and his defensive work when he got close enough to people. His passing generally was pretty good. He was probably one of the better players as far as not conceding possession and giving them an opportunities in transition. So yeah, I thought he played really well, given that he's not going to all of a sudden pick up 3 yards in pace magically against a guy who's lightning fast and 3 or 4 or 5 inches taller than him.
Yeah, I know that doesn't really make sense podcast wise, and it's sort of jumping into a topic that should have been spoken about 40 minutes ago, but I'll give you the last word on it now.
No, I agree. And, I had Taylor and Welsh actually as being, the best performers individually on the night. But in a sense, that's kind of meaningless, because, again, to me, it is all about the team, and it's the team. What is absolutely crucial is that the team is functioning coherently, and it didn't for me, especially without the ball. And so individuals can do their little bits within that, but ultimately, the way that Postecoglou plays, there has to be the team dynamic and then the individuals can shine within that. So I would say Taylor and Welsh, performed well despite everything that was going on around them, frankly, and probably because they were able to react and things happened to go their way, in terms of it wasn't them that misplaced that many passes into midfield. It wasn't them that got caught out on the transition. Yeah, and that was probably just fortune, frankly, because it was actually the system that was failing. So yeah, no, credit to them for good performances, but it's the system that really we need to look at based on last night.
And I think I'm in 100% agreement with Alan there. And I've not been the charter member of the Joe Hart fan club since the time he was signed. But I think to all of a sudden get hypercritical of him is also unfair, for the exact reasons that Alan just cited, which is, it was a system issue, and it basically exposed his weaknesses, and he happened to have a couple of mistakes within that context. But that's the thing. If you stress test people and the system's failing, that's when their weaknesses are all of a sudden going to bubble to the top. And that was on full alert yesterday with Hart, unfortunately. But it's not his fault. I mean, again, all these guys are trying. It's just really tough matchup and some things that went horribly wrong.
Did you forget that we're on TalkSport? You're not supposed to say you feel sorry for some of these players. You're supposed to absolutely ruin their careers and say they should never play for the club again.
Into the
and
bin.
question their integrity and character. That's what you're supposed to do.
They're cowards. So that's my pet peeve is, delving into the emotional side of this, questioning people's, character and their drive and their effort. And, a lot of the times it's just simply bad matchups, bad luck. The fact that these guys aren't fit, and I think that's over the top. And these guys they're all working hard. It's just some of these problems are kind of intractable, as we've talked about.
Yeah. And it was the Real Madrid game, I came away thinking, okay, fair enough. It's Real Madrid. These guys won the Champions League last year. The Shakhtar game I was disappointed with because I felt Celtic left that behind them. I did think that was 3 points the Celtic definitely could have got themselves. And then last night, although I was disappointed with some of the performances, and I was annoyed at some of the safe passing that they did have. I did actually come away just thinking, God, that RB Leipzig side are actually much better than I expected them to be. They were so good. I mean, they're right back. What was his name? Simikin. He was just exceptional on the night, and
that third goal was just, spectacular. Yeah. Absolutely spectacular.
It's really tough to deal with. Just before we finish up, Thomas Kane makes a very excellent point that we should all touch upon, and that is good luck to Omoni and Nicosia tonight. Neil Francis Lennon taking on Manchester United in the Europa League, I think it is, in the Thursday night. So good luck, Neil. I hope everything goes well for you and the 2012 Celtic team. Alan
something tells me he's going to need a Forster type performance from whoever his keeper is, wherever they're based. I don't know.
Cyprus,
I believe.
Okay. Yeah. I'm surprised they didn't actually sign Arthur Burke or someone up at this point in time. He's managed to bring a lot of players who I thought were retired at this point back to the Europa League. So fair play to Neil Lennon, you have to say. Credit where credit is due. He has them playing in the Europa League now, and we'll all watch that on intently, I'm sure. But that's where we'll wrap up the podcast for this evening. St. Johnson this weekend, and then another game against RB Leipzig next week in the Champions League, this time home. So this is where I'm going to be judging Celtic, the home games against these teams.
Especially against Shakhtar. That, to me, is the huge one. That's the one that we should do very well, and not only from a result perspective, but we should perform very well against them in that matchup at home. So that's the biggie.
If Celtic don't come away from this group with 4 points at a minimum, I will be quite annoyed and disappointed at this point in time. But we'll wait and see. We'll
as annoyed as when Jota doesn't score when you've bet the house money, the rent money, or
no?
Did you have
not quite
at least? Did you have him
no?
No.
Ouch. Listen. Remember as well. Just to wrap up. Remember as well. Listen, there's different ways to lose a football match, and although we lost by 2 goals and there's probably got no points, right? At least during the game, you saw, glimpses of the possible, right? That you saw glimpses of the art of the possible. You saw where it could go well. You saw how it could, how Celtic could get results against good teams, right? We could easily have parked the bus, hope to not get beat 5-0, get beat 2-0 anyway, and then go home thinking, well, at least we didn't get hammered and I'm not going to get sacked. And who wants to watch that, right? So at least the art of the possible, it was still, we're still trying to reach for those stars, and there's a bit of nobility in that.
Spoken like a true Ireland international supporter. That's what you are, Alan, at this point in time.
I've converted him.
Yeah. Lads, thanks very much as always, and thanks to everybody who watched and commented live on the stream. If you want to get the podcast back, if you were joining us late, or you want to get the podcast anyway, you can get it on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast as well. And if you want to see our pretty faces every week, then the best place to do that is over on the YouTube channel at the Huddle Breakdown. If you want to subscribe and get the podcast and all the other content across the channel as well. We'll be back again next week. Maybe we might do the same as this week, where we had a sort of a double pod with the league and the preview, and then a review of the home game against RB Leipzig as well. So James, Alan, thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we'll chat to you all later. Good luck.